Hello again, everybody, and I am back again with the second half of 7.2. We're looking at SPS 7B2. And in this EK, we're going to be talking about the ways, or like not the ways necessarily, but the things that influence manufacturing locations. And we're going to talk about this little visual over here about halfway through. We're going to be learning another theory about geography. So hold on to your hats for that one. Now, in general, when we're talking about the things that influence where manufacturing happens, there's a lot of different factors. And you're going to hear or read references to core and periphery. And there are kind of two different ways that we understand this, okay? And when we're thinking about where manufacturing happens, we want to think about core and periphery in these two ways. So the first way could be talking about a core country, the most developed, or you could talk about least developed countries, which would be the periphery. And what we want to kind of understand is that when we're talking about manufacturing, core can also mean where the manufacturing actually happens. And then the periphery in that context would mean the surrounding areas where the raw materials come from. This leads to development patterns within countries and regions, as well as development patterns globally. And so when we're thinking about the global patterns, in that context, core areas tend to be more focused on secondary, tertiary, and above sectors, while periphery is more primary sector and starting to go into secondary sector. Semi-periphery states are going to have elements of both kinds of economic patterns, and you're going to start to see elements of those higher sectors, like we talked about in the first EK, but you're also going to see elements of the primary and secondary sector having maybe a heavier weight on things than what you see in a core country. But again, it's that idea that core areas of manufacturing is like where the manufacturing happens when we're talking about manufacturing, but when we're talking about countries, it's kind of almost a little bit of the reverse in a sense. Okay, so I know it can get pretty confusing. So if you have questions about that, or you just want me to like repeat that in class or like explain it better in class, please ask. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the different things that do influence manufacturing locations and start with labor. So labor is work, right? The people doing the work. And labor costs are a huge factor in overall production costs, which is how much money it takes to make something. So companies try to find places that have relatively low wages, and these can be peripheral areas, both within a country or peripheral countries, that have low education rates and high unemployment, where they can basically exploit the workforce and pay them not a whole lot to do labor. However, it depends on what kind of labor you need, because if you have a type of manufacturing where you need skilled or specialized labor, then wages aren't as big of a concern, and attracting highly qualified individuals is. So wages are often going to be higher when we're talking about skilled labor in manufacturing as opposed to unskilled labor. Now, transportation, as you might imagine, is also going to be a factor. It's been a factor since Unit 5. Well, actually, before that even. We've talked about transportation influencing things since the get-go. And it has an influence here as well, because transportation costs, as well as access to transportation, influence where manufacturing is located, and then the final cost of products. Because the cost of transportation is going to be kind of passed on to the consumer in some respects. So that's why, you kind of want to think about transportation costs as part of the overall process of production. This can include being close to ports, railroads, waterways, airports, road quality, and access to highways and things like that. And there's two kind of big innovations that have really changed the way that transportation and manufacturing operate and affecting the cost of things. So you have the invention of jet cargo planes, which made global and regional trade a lot easier for both raw materials and for finished products. And nowadays, about a third of the world's trade is shipped by air. And these tend to be things that have a high value to weight ratio benefit, in the sense that, like, if you have something that is not terribly heavy and it's also very expensive, then it can be easier to ship it by air than it is through like a shipping container. And that's the type of industry, the type of product that benefits the most from air transportation, because it's still the more expensive type of transportation out there. Now, another thing that's been really innovative is shipping containers. And these are really innovative, and you might not think so, right? Because you're like, oh, shipping container, boo, boring. But they're standardized in size. They can be intermodal, which means that you can change it from being like on a truck to being on a train to being on a ship. And so you don't have to like unpack and repack every time you change a mode of transportation. So it can mean that you are moving goods a lot faster and more cost effectively than you did before. And all kinds of weight things are shipped this way. And about 90% of non-bulk cargo gets shipped this way. Bulk cargo is a little bit different. That might be like bulk grain or bulk, oil or gasoline or something like that. And that's shipped a little bit differently. You don't pack them into shipping containers. But non-bulk stuff is often shipped through shipping containers because it's the most cost effective. And it's easy because you have these big cranes, which my family refers to as cargo dinosaurs, that pick stuff up off of, like the train or off of the back of a semi and put it onto a shipping or a container ship, which would be those big ships like the one that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Now, another thing that has an impact on where you put your manufacturing is something called break of bulk point. So the break of bulk point is a location where bulk cargo, which would be large quantities of unpackaged goods like grain, coal, oil, things like that, they are transferred from one mode of transportation to another. This is pretty expensive and it's labor and time consuming. So if manufacturing sites want to try to reduce their costs, sometimes they will be located close to break of bulk sites, because then that means that they don't have to move things from, like, let's say we're looking at like a big grain silo and you have to put it on a truck, right? And you guys have all seen like semis going down the road with big like bulk stuff in it, right? And you're like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Well, if you eventually get somewhere where you're like, okay, well, not everybody needs a giant truckload of grain. We need to break it up a bit. Then you see that break of bulk where you're going from the bigger to the smaller transportation or sizes. And that's where you're going to see some manufacturing happening, is where that transfer happens because it's cheaper for them in the long run. Okay, let's get to this little graphy chart picture thingy. Okay, so we're talking about least cost theory. Now, least cost theory was established by a German economist called Alfred Weber, but it is written W-E-B-E-R, so you might be thinking Weber, but it is pronounced Weber, like with a V, but it's not a V, because, why not? And this was established in order to explain how manufacturing companies decide where to locate their factories. That was the word I was looking for. And you can see here, like this would be where the factory is. And in the model, the factory has two different kinds of raw materials, and they want to figure out where to place their factory so that they're balancing the costs of transporting the raw materials with the cost of transporting the finished product to market. So you can see here, the market, raw material 1, raw material 2, factory. And the goal is to kind of figure out what is going to be the least cost of all of that transportation. So Weber basically said you need to take into consideration both the distance of transporting things, but also the weight of both the raw materials and the finished products. And his theory was that the heavier the load, the higher the costs, and the longer the distance, the higher the costs. So you want to be closer to heavier things, so you don't have to move the heavier stuff further, but you can be further from lighter things because they don't cost as much to move as heavy things, and it kind of cancels itself out, if that makes sense. Like the heavier stuff you want to be closer to because it's going to cost you more to move heavy stuff, like let's say 3 miles, than it costs something that's lightweight to move 3 miles. And so you want to be closer to the heavier stuff because then that offsets the cost of the distance for the lighter materials. Hopefully that makes sense. And if the raw materials are heavier, you want to be closer to them. But if the finished product is heavier, you want to be closer to the market. And so this whole theory works really well when you apply it to things like soft drinks, where you have bottling factories, right? And so the heaviest part of soft drinks is the water, which would be something you have to have in the finished product. So what you see oftentimes with soft drink manufacturers is that they are located closer to their markets, partly because it's pretty easy to get water, at least here in the United States. And so they can get that heavier part of their product somewhere that's close to a market. And so they don't have to worry about being close to the water source as much as they do with the market. So that kind of offsets their cost. Now, there are obviously going to be issues with this theory, and it's always important to know what the kind of downsides are or the ways that it doesn't quite work. So it's an abstract concept, and it doesn't always reflect real world factors, especially if you think about like, okay, well, what if the factory has 7 different raw materials? And what if they have 4 markets that they sell to? Then this turns into a really complicated like game of cat's cradle. So, ow, cat. I just had a cat springboard off of me. So that was nice. Any hoozle. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that it assumes that the people in the factories who make the decisions know all of the factors, which they generally don't. And or at least it's difficult for them to know all of those factors when making those decisions. And those factors can change over time too. So that's another consideration. And also, transportation costs today are less important than production costs like labor, especially in highly skilled jobs. And so this kind of throws off the theory a bit because it's only taking into consideration the input and the output of the materials, the physical stuff, but not the labor. So that's something else that has to be considered when we're talking about influences on where they put the markets, or not the markets, sorry, the factories. Okay, another thing would be markets. So when we're talking about markets, we want to also keep in mind that the delivery of goods to a market is technically a post-production cost, but it impacts overall costs and profits because being close to or far from a market can make your product more or less expensive for consumers. And the goal is to kind of offset the cost for you with the cost for the consumer. And, distance to market is going to be one of those things that can change that. Now, generally speaking, manufacturing wants to be located as close to its consumer base as practical and affordable, which those consumers could be other manufacturers who use those intermediary products to make other things for a final consumer, or it can be the final consumers, the individual people who are buying things. And transportation and market costs do have to be weighed alongside other cost considerations like labor and transportation. And it kind of fits with transportation in that sense, right? Because we're looking at how to get our stuff to market. But when we're talking about transportation the first time, it has more to do with getting the raw materials to the manufacturers, which brings us to resources. And this is going to include the raw materials like natural resources, but also energy and intermediary products. So the intermediary products would be things like steel sheets, which have been manufactured from iron ore that another company is going to use to like punch out car doors, for example. And it also takes into consideration the idea that you want to be close to intermediary products, which are your resources, as well as the raw materials that you need. And the type of energy you use in your manufacturing can also impact your costs and also can impact where you put your factories, because if you're a place like, let's say, aluminum factories need a lot of electricity in order to operate. So a lot of them tend to be like close to cheaper types of electricity like hydroelectric dams, because it's more cost effective for them to be close to that and get the energy needs that they have met. Okay, so that's about it for this one. If you guys have any questions or there's anything you want me to clarify, especially if you're like, I don't understand break of bulk or I don't understand least cost, please ask. And I will do my best to make more sense in our Zoom meetings if this was confusing. All right, guys, I will see you later. Have a good rest of your day. Let me know if you have questions.